Today we have a crazy story of revenge against a stepsister. We'll get into that in a bit, but first, my English teacher graded my coursework unjustly and I proved her bias to the entire school. I lived in quite a small town at that point. It was the kind of town where everyone knew each other and your parents were either in the same clique of friends, having the whole family at one family hangout or the other every other week. Because of the closely relatedness of the town where I lived, there was not much of a choice when it came to high school. I think I need to add here that I was never one of those students who had straight A's in their papers or had a standard 4.0 GPA. I was your regular average high school student and I fought for every grade and point that appeared on my worksheet while combining academics with being on the miniature robotics team. You could say I was a strong B student, and one of the classes I seemed to excel beautifully at was English. But I was almost made to think I was not good enough. It started when Miss Williams, 45-year-old female, our English teacher, handed us the last essay we wrote on the Shakespearean love poem, "Shall I compare you to a summer's day?" Our task was easy: access the poem, appraise it, and give personal notes on the relevance of it in the contemporary world. It was a task I was eager to do, and at the same time, I eagerly anticipated what the result would be. A part of me wished for an A, but as I scanned the pages for my grade, I was met with a crushing disappointment. A prominent, unjust C adorned the top of my paper. My first thought was that I probably handed in the wrong pages of the essay, so I quickly scanned through, hoping I was right. I wasn't. The confusion and frustration gripped me as I compared my essay with the comments and markings that peppered the pages. The feedback was vague and lacked substance, and most importantly, it failed to justify the mediocre grade I had received. What had I missed? Was there a flaw in my interpretation of the poem? No concrete answers to the question that danced around in my head. I scanned the classroom, checking if there was any other person that looked remotely unpleased with the grade on their paper. I could read the look of confusion I had on a couple of faces, especially on the faces of the students that you would expect to spot a 90% grade mark. And that was the last confirmation I needed to know for sure that we had been graded unjustly. And I, for one, could not be graded down, especially not in the one subject I thought was my strong suit. The whole thing seemed fishy, and I couldn't help but feel like she marked based on her subjectivity towards the writers, rather than focusing on what was written. But it was just a feeling at first, at least till I decided to test out my theory. I did not know where my actions would take me, but asking questions randomly was the sensible place to start. I began by asking my classmates individually about their grades in the last paper. I was deliberate about those I was questioning. The goal was to check their last grade and if they deserved better than they got. For those who scored extremely high, my goal was to check if they felt they were deserving of the score and what they did differently from other papers. And as I suspected, there was an unsettling pattern. I realized that for some reason, those that you would have expected to have done better in the class per the smart kids did not do that well. It was a charade of C's just like mine, and for a moment, I began to console myself thinking that if the smart kids could give a C, I should be happy I wasn't graded a D or worse. Something within me just refused to take it and roll over. I decided to leave the uneven and unexpected turns of events in the current paper to check if there had been any sort of difference in the score level from the previous grades for that school year. I delved into a tally of previous tests, quizzes, and papers that had been recorded since the beginning of the year, and what I stumbled upon was a bit unexpected. Those who were far from being top students suddenly had an increase in grades. And the increase was not gradual based on the tally I took. It was like a sudden push from being below average to topping the class, and this was peculiar to just 2 students. I didn't know it for sure, but I could sense that something was not right. However, what confirmed my suspicions was one afternoon, while I was casually looking through the classroom watching how Miss Williams interacted with members of the class, and those 2 I was suspecting, and suddenly I noticed these weird series of subtle nods that were exchanged between them right when she told us of our next reading and assessment paper. This action ruled out the possibility of cheating on the part of the students that was beginning to take form in my mind. What came upon me was the thought of favoritism and unjust passing based on this likeness that Miss Williams took for these students. This was what made me adamant about trying to set things back to the right part. So, I decided it was time to confront her based on my suspicions. That day, after school had ended, I approached her classroom, determined to get a true picture of the scenario. I knocked on the door and entered, finding Mrs. Williams engrossed in grading papers. She looked up and I saw the expression on her face shift from concentration to surprise upon seeing me. "Miss Williams, we need to talk," I asserted, my voice steady but laced with confusion and a bit of anger. When I saw that I'd gotten her attention, I delved into how I took a tally of the scores that we had received from the last paper, starting with the fact that I felt I was marked unjustly in the Shakespearean poem. She seemed not to understand what I was saying and asserted that she had marked our papers based on the grading rubric that she had always used. But I knew that was a lie. I knew it, she knew it, and lots of other students who had seen the degrading C knew it too. I proceeded to tell her that I suspected a case of favoritism among students' grades, as those who didn't do as much based on my observation had higher grades. Miss Williams attempted to deflect from the point of the conversation and began to question me as to the right I had to assess her grading scheme or come to a conclusion that some students were not deserving of the marks she awarded them. With everything I said, I realized that she was neither remorseful nor was she willing to accept that she had conducted herself in an unprofessional manner. I thought that the only way to make her see the wrong in what she had done was to bring the matter up to the entire school. Going to the principal was an option, but there was every chance that I would get sidelined there, so I decided against that. The only option that seemed remotely possible was to use my influence in the school's magazine corner for student gossip. The idea was that since the gossip column was usually anonymous, no one would trace it back to me unless Miss Williams decided to out me as the only one who had come to complain about grades and accuse her of being unjust in the grading. It was safe to predict that she would not expect that kind of publicity, so I went with that. For each article, I wrote I did it with precision, not hinting at a grade, subject, task, or teacher involved. I spoke from an objective point of view. You could call it something like, "if the shoe fits." With each sentence and phrase, I made my points on unbiased grading, emphasizing the importance of fair evaluation and the potential consequences of favoritism. Drawing on educational principles, I crafted well-researched pieces that questioned the status quo without explicitly exposing Miss Williams. My major belief was that rather than point my fingers at her for the grades and the way I believed she'd handled the grading of our papers in recent times, people would begin to notice the sudden changes in their grades and call her out themselves. I hoped that it would at a point generate a bigger issue, and her previous marking schemes would be called into question. As the days progressed, people began to get more interested in the gossip column than in the news section of the magazine. It was like a local expose that was building momentum with each weekly release, and people could not wait for the next one. I like to think that the fact that the writer remained anonymous added a layer of spice to the scenario for those who stood by the side. But more than that, with the school community engrossed in the articles and hopeful that a name or names of those who have been involved in these practices were named, thoughtful conversations started ongoing amongst different cliques of students. Still, I said nothing. After a while, we had to write another paper on Shakespeare's Macbeth, and with this, I decided to let this be my final act of revenge on Miss Williams, since she was unwilling to accept the fact that she was being unjust with her grading. I decided to duplicate the paper into two identical versions, one bearing my name and the other adorned with the name of one of Miss Williams' favorite students. It was a trap I knew she would unknowingly fall into. After submission, knowing that the papers would be distributed in the next class, I approached the principal with a confession. I revealed my identity as the writer of the gossip column articles. The principal's eyebrows knitted in a mixture of surprise and curiosity, unsure of what I was talking about. I made him understand that I had noticed the inconsistencies after walking up to Miss Williams and how she deflected from the major point of my complaints. I knew he didn't believe me since I was just a student, but for some reason, he chose to see the end goal of what I had in mind. That day, he came into the classroom just before she started to share the papers back to us. Since I told him the names I'd used on both papers, he made his search directed there. The principal scrutinized the contents, his face betraying no hint of emotion, and just as I predicted, one paper bore the damning mark of a C. while the other gleamed with the unblemished radiance of an A. Whereas both of them had the same contents, there was no way the grading would have been different had she followed the right grading rubric. No one in the class knew the papers he took at that moment, but within me, I knew it could only be the papers I had planted. In the end, we students had no idea what transpired between the principal and Miss Williams after the class incident. All we knew was that a couple of days later, we had a new English teacher and had to take a makeup test, as all of our previous graded papers had been discarded. No one in the class knew why, and till this moment, I do not know the real details, but I could take a wild guess why. I'm kind of curious what most people who went to a public school would think their principal would do in a situation like this. How many of those schools out there would just try to cover it up, maybe replace the teacher but still keep the grades? How many out there would actually have some kind of system in place where they can actually do some kind of makeup and get like an actual grade because the whole thing is obviously compromised? And I'm willing to bet there would be a number of public schools out there that would just try to cover the whole thing up and act like nothing's wrong at all. That said, our next story is, my sibling betrayed my trust and I made a fool of him. I have two siblings, Jake and Patricia. Of both of my siblings, I was closer to Jake. Maybe because he's of the same gender as I am, or because he was more relatable to me than Patricia. The bond between Jake and I was quite unbreakable. Not even our parents could find a way to pick apart what we had both concluded on. It was easy being Jake's sibling. The bond, laughter, understanding, and friendship. This was why the last person I would have expected to betray my trust was Jake. He was never on my list of possibilities, but apparently you could not fully trust your blood or be sure that there are things they would never do. The starting point of this was one random weekend while our parents were out of town and our sister had gone for one of their cheesy all-girls hangout at the mall. We were left at home, bored out of our minds, and decided that going around the area was going to be adventurous. We decided on this abandoned building that was just down the road from our street. In no time, we were at the building, already going through the corridors as though there was no fear within us. Of course, we were scared. But whoever admitted to that fear was in fear of being trolled the rest of the way home. However, the excitement of doing something this horrifying was intriguing, so we kept at it. It got really boring really fast, or maybe it was just the fear that was talking within us that made us decide we were better off playing board games at home, so we left for home. On getting home, Jake refused to climb up the stairs to get the chessboard from his room where he and one of his homeroom buddies had played it last, and I decided to get it instead. At first, I could not find the board, and this made me begin to scatter parts of the room. I checked through his wardrobe and under the bed, before finally deciding on taking a last run to the top of the wardrobe, where a couple of junks were kept. I was not intending on snooping around, but there was this metal jacket that caught my eye. It was hidden towards the back, and I would have never have seen it had I not been in search of something else. I decided on opening it, and nothing could have prepared me for what I saw next. The first thing was a piece of an heirloom that our mom had been furious about me losing, and while I was confused as to how it ended up in Jake's room, seeing the pages of the letters I wrote to a female friend of mine that I had very strong feelings for, and the letter carried that information. A couple of months ago, we broke contact. It was a silly misunderstanding that could have been avoided and explained, but for some reason we were both adamant on retaining our truths. It drove us apart. And at a point, when I felt like it was time to let the past remain in the past, I got to their house to find out that they had moved and dropped their supposed new location in the former house. I tried to reach her through her contact for weeks nonstop, but that was as futile as going to their house. So I decided it wasn't a bad idea to go the 90s way by sending letters to the new address, since I couldn't be there physically. This was where my love letter started. Once in 2 weeks, I ensured that I sent these letters out to her, explaining why things went the way they did, while begging and asking her to return my letters or send me a text. I kept at this for 2 years, till I saw my letters in Jake's room. Apparently my letters never left the house. Not once in these months. Why? That was a question that stayed in my mind as I placed the letters back into the metal jacket and picked up the board that was lying just by the back of the door to his room. I went back to the living room and pretended that I hadn't just seen a testament to my brother's betrayal. Not just the letters, but also the heirloom I was grounded for 4 days for losing. We began the game when I went downstairs, and I apologized for not finding the board easily. Mid-game, I felt this surge of annoyance within me, and I chose to forfeit the game, saying I was tired from all the running we had to do going to the abandoned building. Luckily, he bought my lame story, and I went to my room still wondering what the heck that metal jacket was, and praying it was a figment of my imagination. While I was in the room, I became more enraged and embarrassed about the letters. They had carried my deepest emotions, and somehow they found themselves in Jake's hands. Most likely he would have read them. I felt betrayed. It hurt to the point where I considered going back downstairs and asking him what he was about. But I had a feeling that he would deny the allegations and pretend he had no idea how the stuff in the metal jacket got to his room. I wanted revenge back at him for causing me to be grounded and missing the qualifying game of the football team last year. I wanted revenge back at him for messing with my plans of getting back together with Keisha, but I did not know how to go about it in a way that made a fool out of him. Carefully, and with as much precision as I could gather, I began to plot how to get my revenge. He needed to face the kind of embarrassment I felt when I realized that my letters were in his hands. But he didn't deserve to face the embarrassment in solitude like I did when I found the metal jacket. It had to be massive. That was the only way we could go back to being cordial. I am that petty and I did not mind it. The first thing I did then was to begin to gather evidence that he could not deny, and the only way to do that was with the heirloom and the letters that he stole. I took them into my possession, but this wasn't before I took several pictures with timestamps on where I found them. And once I had them in my hand, all I had to do was wait for the right time to execute the plan that I was wickedly scheming in my head. The perfect time presented itself when my parents went out for a work event at my mom's place of work, and Patricia was always as engrossed in her plans that never seemed to include Jake or me. I had them all to myself. So what did I do exactly? That afternoon, I knew we would be alone till the next day, and I could do as I pleased. So I stylishly guided his thought to making us return back to the abandoned building. I approached Jake with a nonchalant demeanor, casually reminiscing about our previous adventure in the abandoned building. I played on the excitement we had shared, knowing it would pique his curiosity. He was my brother after all, and I knew him to a large extent. Hey, remember that old place? Wouldn't it be fun to go back and relive those memories, I suggested, emphasizing the thrill of our past exploration, and specifically how we had run back home happy and scared at the same time. In that instant, Jake was drawn by nostalgia for the building, and the chance to complete the adventure that we started was a sweet thing to do with our parents out of town. The prospect of revisiting the abandoned building seemed enticing, especially with the added incentive of proving our bravery by bringing along some friends. As I said, I wanted his foolery to be evident to others, not just my family members, because I suspected that my parents would not find the revenge as much as others would. So in my plan, I planned to entice him to call his other friends into the mix. It was the perfect touch to amplify the exploration such that we could laugh at them when they got scared, like we did the first time we went to the building. But in actual fact, the reason was to amplify the embarrassment that awaited him in one of the rooms. Imagine how fun it would be if we all went together at night, I proposed, planting the idea that we could mock them if they were scared. Jake, eager to showcase his bravado, readily agreed and made the calls to gather his friends. That sealed it. Later that night, we met up in our house since our place was the closest to the abandoned building. Each person came with their flashlights and we marched down the road to the building. For them, they were thrilled by the idea of the exploration, while I, on the other hand, was thrilled by the unfolding of the plan in my mind. We got to the front of the building and everyone took a deep breath before venturing into the door. We were silent all the way as we moved from room to room, checking out what lay forgotten in each of them. To Jake and the rest of his friends, the way we moved from one room into another was simply coincidence, or should I say fate? However, I knew the truth. I made a passive movement that suggested each room we went to, a little turning to the left, or painting my flashlight to the room as though I'd seen something moving. They were thrilled with the adventure, and not for once did they go in the other direction than the one I intended. All my moves were to lure them into a particular room. But when we got to the room, I was deliberate about not hinting at the exact location of the compartment where I'd hidden the letters and the heirloom. With 5 people in the same room of not more than 15 inches, it wasn't long before one of his friends stumbled on the compartment. The good part of the find was that they had not seen anything worthwhile through the rooms I'd deliberately taken them through, and as soon as something looked promising, everyone quickly gathered around. I feigned surprise and enthusiasm, adding a layer of deception to the unfolding drama. "What's this?" I exclaimed, picking up the letters and examining them as if seeing them for the first time. Immediately, Jake sighted the heirloom. I saw him glance in my direction, and immediately I did the same, such as that he would see the surprise on my face. Then we began to check through the letters that were in the compartment, but the letters were far beyond what Jake had expected. Before we could check through, he tried to snatch the letters from his friends in a bid to save me, since he knew what the contents were supposed to be. However, what he did not know was that earlier in the day, I had visited the abandoned building alone, carefully placing the missing heirloom and the letters in locations, but the letters had been modified. The letters now bear Jake's name and the name of a girl he had a long-standing crush on. In an instant, his friends began to laugh hysterically as they connected the dots. They believed that the reason Jake tried to snatch the letters from them was because he was trying to hide the truth of his crush. Jake never found out the truth about the letters, and I got my revenge by making a fool out of him. I mean, I don't know if he was too embarrassed to accuse OP, but like, what else could have been the answer? Somebody broke into their house, stole the letters, forged it in Jake's name and put it there? They probably didn't accuse OP because it's just pretty darn obvious who did it. I mean, them being silent is probably like their kind of way of just saying, "Alright, I admit it, you got me, we're even." This next story is, my stepsister got me grounded for a month, and I got her sent to a boarding school. Emma was not always my sister, at least not from birth. I used to be the only child after my parents' marriage had fallen out. Of course, I didn't know what was up at that point in time. All I knew was that one day I returned from an appointment with a doctor and mom was gone. As in, gone for good in the awkward sense of death because she suddenly could not do this anymore. I still nurture the feeling that this in that context was in reference to me, as I had medical complications that required frequent hospital trips as a child. But that was then. From treatments, trips, and whatnot, at the age of 7 thereabout, I was a bit stable, but my mom was not there to see that. She was done before then. Dad stayed as a widower for a couple of years after that, dwelling in the sadness for a while longer than he should have. But at a point, he was over it and back in the search for companionship that he could not get from his male child. It was fine. I was older so I could understand what was going on, and I couldn't bring myself to blame him. So when he introduced me to my stepmom Lisa, I made little resistance. She made him laugh and he seemed happier whenever he spoke about her or brought her into our space. They met at a community event and somehow, the widower and the divorcee found a spark of love and chose to give love a chance again. But their individual relationships came with one kid each. They were cool with it and so were we, the kids. Not that we had a choice in the matter, but it was good to know that our parents were happy, and I for one was done being the only child. Having a step-sibling was not a bad idea, or should I say that I did not think it would be a bad idea. At least not until Emma got me grounded for a month following my 4-day suspension from high school. We were not instantly best of friends, even with the fact that we wanted our parents to be together and happy. There was this initial resistance to welcoming each other into our worlds that we showed, but over the next weeks and months used in family gatherings and spur-of-the-moment hangouts, we were cool, and all was fine till it was not. We started with a couple of pranks. It was nothing too serious, just silly pranks that would get the other person looking silly at home. The plan was to never let the prank leave the confines of our house. Our parents knew of the prank war that was ongoing between Emma and me, but didn't feel the need to intervene since it was sibling banter. No one was supposed to get hurt. But I guess Emma never got that memo and she messed with my history class presentation. That weekend, I finalized the presentation I was to give in class. It was Black History Month and I could not afford to mess that up. I got it done and took to memory the part I could not fit in the 10-slide presentation. I got to class prepared to dish out the knowledge I'd researched and planned on, connected my PC to the screen, and lo and behold, my presentation had been altered. Instead of the right dates, commentary, and summary, I had written on the sides of the tiny bits of pictures in my presentation, what the entire class saw was a mumbled jumbo of inflammatory words and offensive language. The worst part was how I stood glued to the floor, struck in shock as to how Emma could have messed with my schoolwork. I was stuck till the slideshow ended. While the class erupted in laughter with each change of presentation slide, my history teacher was beyond livid. She asked what the meaning of my scandalous presentation was and took my silence to be an admission of guilt. Instantly, I was marched to the principal's office and suspended for 4 school days. And the juicy icing on the top of the cake was my 1 week of community service during lunch hour when I resumed school after my suspension. But this was not all. Getting home that day, I decided to keep to myself, and when Richard, my father, came back home from work, he was enraged. Apparently, you do not get suspended without the school informing your parents. He barged into my room that night demanding to know what drugs I'd been sporting, which made me believe getting suspended for playing pranks with my history assignment was what he needed to deal with. Usually, he would have at least given me a chance to express myself and explain why things turned out the way they did, but that was a luxury I got by being the only child. That changed when Lisa and Emma moved in completely, so all he heard was the distorted version of how and why I got suspended. From this perspective, he believed that I'd grown too comfortable with myself and needed to be kept in check such that I would get a lesson on accountability and responsibility. And you could guess what this check was. A month of being grounded. A full month of 4 weeks without TV or electronic devices, and an hour daily with the family desktop computer in my dad's study, supervised. If you're wondering where Emma was while all of this was ongoing, you would be shocked to know that she and Lisa had taken a week off work and school to see Lisa's parents, meaning that I was alone to face the backlash while she was somewhere else getting spoiled and babied by her grandparents. It did not seem remotely fair. In the days that followed, Lisa and Emma returned from their visit, and while I would have expected her to even acknowledge that she was the reason why I was grounded and why I would possibly be failing my history lesson that year, she said nothing. Not as much as a word was said about my presentation, my suspension, or my being grounded. Not to talk of an apology for taking the prank too far and beyond the limits of our unspoken rule. I was livid. All I could have asked for was accountability for being at fault. Not to our parents, but at least to me who was on the receiving end of her actions. I took the days of my punishment from school silently and resumed school. I wrote an apology letter to the entire class and the history teacher for the way I conducted myself the previous week. After 2 weeks, my dad lifted the grounding rule, but I had an earlier curfew instead. Yet, there was no acknowledgement of her wrongdoing. This was when I decided to give her a taste of her actions. I needed to explore what she feared the most. I knew that was the only way I could get to avenge the prank she played on me. The perfect way to do that was with her aversion to boarding school. It was by luck I got to realize that Lisa had threatened Emma with the idea of an all-girls boarding school when she found her misbehaving. I didn't know the context of the misbehavior, but I was opportune to be within hearing distance when Emma was telling one of her girlfriends that her mom had to be calmed down from the consistent threats of boarding schooling. It presented the best way to strike back, so I did my research. Once I got the closest school that she could be forced to go to, all that remained was for me to make her mom have a reminder of her threats and position Emma in a scenario that would undoubtedly make her act on her age-long threats. It was kind of tasking, but each time I remember the humiliation I faced in class that day, I got more push to get the revenge done. After much research, I figured out the possible school that Lisa could have in mind. None of them was in the same state that we were. It fit right into my plan because I knew there was no way I could get the whole revenge done without Emma finding out that I was involved. It would be better if she found out when I was out of reach. With the possible schools concluded, I got to the harder part of the revenge, getting her actually implicated. The first part of my implication was getting the forged letters in her name, those addressed to her and those she addressed to a boy in her class. The good part, or should I say what made deciding the person to use in my forged letters easy, was that I'd heard her speak about him to her friends before. His name was not totally strange within the walls of our house. I capitalized on that and the fact that they share a couple of classes together to weave my implicative letters. I picked Dave and began to weave the tale, true or untrue, of romantic gestures and whatnot. We were all teenagers, so I was well armed with things and how we communicated with those that had something going on between them. The letter spoke of secret admiration. I sprained it with inside jokes that only they would be able to make sense of. Events that happened in class, fueling Emma's insecurities with carefully chosen words that hinted at the very fears her mother had once weaponized. This way, her mom, on finding the letters, would think that she continued in the act and did it behind her back, knowing her disposition to it and the threat. This, I believed, would make her act on her threat. When I was done concocting my plans, I kept the papers waiting till the right time to show my cards. And when the time was finally right, picked them up and stylishly left them unattended in the laundry room. I was sure that Lisa would do the laundry that day, and there was no way she would not clear out the room. If the papers were visible enough, she'd find them and my revenge would be done. However, there was a twist in my plan. For some reason, she made Emma do the laundry and clear out the room, and as I predicted, the papers were not found by Lisa, but by Emma. After finding the papers, she came into my room asking if I knew who the papers came about and why they were in the laundry room. Of course, I feigned ignorance, asking what she was talking about. She began to raise her voice, and due to the law of speaking in low tones when indoors that Lisa had, she rushed to my room demanding to know what the ruckus was all about. This was my entry point. I quickly explained that Emma was accusing me of doing something I had no idea about, and I quickly chipped in the presence of a letter. She demanded to see the letter I was talking about, and the reluctance of Emma to present the letter, Lisa got more interested. The whole thing happened too fast. From the letter demand to the stammered sentences that Emma made when Lisa asked her who Dave was, all I knew was that a week later, Emma was enrolled and packed to spend 1 week with her grandparents before going to school. And unsurprisingly, the school that was chosen was more stringent than I had anticipated. At a point, I began to feel bad but remembered how humiliated I felt that day in history class. The little guilt that was creeping up on me disappeared. I feel like there's so many classic movies or stories where it's like, no, don't send me to boarding school, evil parent. I can't believe OP actually lived that experience. At least they weren't the ones that had to go to boarding school. But with that being said, that's all the time we have for today. Now, if you want to hear another absolutely crazy revenge story, check out that video on the left. Or if you missed my latest video, check out that video on the right. That said, I'll see you all next time with some more stories.